Every Thursday you honor a god you have never worshipped. You do not think about it. You do not pause before writing the word in your calendar or typing it into your phone. Thursday, Thor's Day, the day of thunder. It has been this way for over 1,000 years, and no one asked your permission. But it is not just Thursday. Wednesday belongs to Odin, the one-eyed god who traded his eye for wisdom. Tuesday belongs to Tyr, who sacrificed his hand to bind a cosmic wolf. Friday belongs to Frigg, goddess of marriage and prophecy. 4 days out of every 7, the English-speaking world moves through time inside a framework built by people it was taught to call barbarians, and the words go deeper than the calendar. Every time you look through a window, you are using the Old Norse word vindauga, which meant wind-eye, a hole cut into a wall to let air pass. Every time you say the word law, you are speaking Old Norse. Every time you say husband, wrong, knife, egg, skin, skull, slaughter, or happy, the syllables forming in your mouth were shaped a millennium ago by farmers and sailors from the frozen edge of Europe. The English language carries more Norse DNA than most English speakers will ever know. This is a story about those people, not the horned helmets, which they never wore, not the mindless savagery, which was largely a myth written by their victims. This is the story of how a few 100,000 people from 3 Scandinavian kingdoms reshaped the coastlines, languages, legal systems, and bloodlines of an entire continent in less than 3 centuries. It begins on a specific morning at a specific place in the year 793. The island of Lindisfarne sits just off the northeastern coast of England, connected to the mainland by a thin strip of sand that disappears at high tide. In the late 8th century, it held one of the most famous monasteries in all of Christendom, a place of learning, prayer, and illuminated manuscripts. The monks who lived there had no walls. They had no soldiers. They had gold crosses, silver chalices, jeweled book covers, and absolute faith that God would protect them. On the 8th of June, 793, longships appeared on the horizon. The monks did not know what they were. Within hours, the monastery was burning. Monks lay dead on the beach. Sacred relics were stripped of their gold. Survivors were dragged to the ships in chains. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded the event with horror, mentioning fiery dragons seen in the sky before the attack, as if nature itself had tried to warn them. A scholar named Alcuin, writing from the court of Charlemagne, asked a question that would echo for centuries. He wrote that it had been nearly 350 years since the English people came to Britain, and never before had such a terror appeared. He could not understand it. No one in Christian Europe could. That raid on Lindisfarne is the date most historians use to mark the beginning of the Viking Age, but the people who carried it out did not call themselves Vikings. That word, whose exact origin is still debated, probably came from the Old Norse vik, meaning inlet or bay, and it described an activity, not an identity. To go Viking meant to go raiding, to go adventuring by sea. The men and women behind that word called themselves Norsemen, or simply the people of the north. They came from the lands we now call Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, 3 kingdoms that in the 8th century were not yet fully unified. 3 landscapes of fjords, mountains, frozen lakes, and dark forests that stretched to the Arctic Circle. To understand why they exploded outward, you must first understand the land that made them. Scandinavia is a paradox of beauty and scarcity. The Norwegian coastline alone stretches over 1,500 miles if you trace every fjord, every inlet, every island. It is one of the most dramatic landscapes on Earth, carved by glaciers over millions of years into deep vertical valleys where salt water cuts dozens of miles inland between cliffs that rise 1,000 feet straight up. It is breathtaking. It is also, for the purposes of agriculture, nearly useless. Only about 3% of Norway's land is arable, Denmark is flatter and more fertile but small. Sweden has forests and iron ore, but its growing season in the north lasts barely 4 months. In winter, parts of Scandinavia receive fewer than 4 hours of daylight. The cold is not a metaphor. It is a constant grinding pressure on every harvest, every herd, every family. For centuries, the Norse adapted. They became extraordinary farmers on the thin margins of possibility, growing barley and oats in narrow coastal strips, raising cattle and sheep on hillside pastures. They became expert fishermen, hunting cod, herring, and whale in the North Sea. They became skilled woodworkers because wood was one of the few resources they had in abundance, and they built with it the way Egyptians built with stone. Their society organized around the household, the farm, the clan. Leadership was not inherited automatically but earned through reputation, generosity, and strength. Disputes were settled at a gathering called the Thing, from the Old Norse word thing, meaning assembly. Free men came together, heard grievances, passed judgments, and made law. The concept was not democracy in the modern sense, but it was structured, deliberative, and remarkably egalitarian for its time. Women in Norse society held rights that would not appear elsewhere in Europe for another 800 years. A Norse woman could own property, request a divorce, and reclaim her dowry. She managed the household completely when her husband was away, and the keys she wore at her belt were a symbol of real authority, not decoration. But by the late 700s, something was changing. The population was growing. The thin soil could not keep up. Inheritance customs meant that only the eldest son received the family farm, leaving younger sons with ambition, skill, and nothing. At the same time, Norse shipbuilding had reached a technological breakthrough that would alter the course of European history: the longship. There is no way to overstate what this vessel meant. It was not simply a boat, it was the most advanced maritime technology on Earth at the time, and it would remain so for another 2 centuries. A typical longship was roughly 75 feet long and 17 feet wide, built from overlapping planks of oak fastened with iron rivets, a method called clinker construction. Its keel was carved from a single trunk, giving it structural strength and the ability to flex with ocean waves instead of fighting them. It drew less than 3 feet of water. This is the detail that changed everything. A draft of less than 3 feet meant a longship could sail across the open Atlantic, navigate the shallow rivers of France and Russia, beach directly on a sandy shore, and retreat before any defender could mount a response. It could carry 60 warriors and their supplies, or alternatively, tons of trade goods. It could be rowed in dead calm or sailed at speeds exceeding 15 knots in a strong wind. It was, by any engineering standard, a masterpiece, and so the combination was complete: a growing population with too little land, a warrior culture that rewarded boldness, a legal tradition that gave younger sons nothing, and a ship that could reach any coastline in Europe in a matter of days. The explosion was inevitable. After Lindisfarne, it did not stop. In the decades following 793, Norse raiders struck the coasts of England, Scotland, Ireland, and France with increasing frequency and increasing ambition. What began as summer raids, quick strikes on undefended monasteries and coastal villages, evolved into something larger. By the 840s and 850s, the Norse were no longer arriving in handfuls of ships. They were arriving in fleets. In 845, a fleet of 120 Viking ships sailed up the Seine and besieged Paris. The Frankish king, Charles the Bald, paid them 7,000 pounds of silver to leave. It was the first of many such payments across Europe, a practice that would later be formalized in England under the name Danegeld, literally Dane gold, a tax levied on the English people to pay off their Norse attackers. The sums were staggering. Between 991 and 1014, English kings paid an estimated 250,000 pounds of silver in Danegeld, an amount so large it reshaped the silver economy of Northern Europe. But the Norse were never only raiders. This is the myth that most needs correcting. For every long ship that carried warriors to a monastery, another carried traders to a market. The Norse created one of the most extensive trade networks of the medieval world, stretching from Newfoundland in the west to Baghdad in the east. Swedish Norsemen, known as the Varangians, sailed east and south, navigating the rivers of what is now Russia, hauling their ships overland between river systems until they reached the Black Sea and the Caspian. They traded furs, amber, walrus ivory, and enslaved people for Arab silver, Byzantine silk, and spices. The city of Kiev was founded by Varangians. The very name Russia may derive from Rus, the Finnish word for the Swedish Norsemen who settled along the Dnieper River. In Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire and the richest city on earth, Norse warriors served as the personal bodyguard of the emperor in an elite unit called the Varangian Guard, a regiment so trusted and feared that it survived for over 300 years. To the west, the Norse did something even more extraordinary. They discovered, explored, and settled lands that no European had ever seen. In 870, Norwegian settlers reached Iceland, a volcanic island in the middle of the North Atlantic, over 600 miles from the nearest European coast. They established a colony that within 60 years had a population of roughly 30,000, its own legal system, and a general assembly called the Althing, founded in 930. The Althing is often cited as the oldest surviving parliament in the world, and it still functions today, over 1,000 years later, in the capital city of Reykjavik. From Iceland, the Norse pushed further. Around 982, a man named Eric the Red, who had been exiled from Iceland for manslaughter, sailed west and discovered a massive, ice-covered landmass. He called it Greenland, a name that was, by any honest measure, a real estate advertisement. He wanted settlers, and the name worked. 2 colonies were established on Greenland's southwestern coast, and they survived for nearly 500 years before mysteriously vanishing in the 1400s. And then, around the year 1000, Eric's son did something that would remain unknown to the rest of Europe for 5 centuries. His name was Leif Erikson. According to the Icelandic sagas, Leif sailed west from Greenland and reached a land he called Vinland, a place with wild grapes, salmon larger than any he had seen, and forests of hardwood. For decades, historians debated whether Vinland was real or legend. Then, in 1960, a Norwegian archaeologist named Helge Ingstad and his wife Anne Stein Ingstad discovered the remains of a Norse settlement at Lanso Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland, Canada. The site contained the foundations of 8 buildings, a forge, and artifacts unmistakably Norse in origin. The dating was conclusive. Around the year 1000, roughly 500 years before Columbus set sail, Norse men and women had lived on the coast of North America. They had built houses, repaired ships, and smelted iron on a continent that Europe did not know existed. 3 figures define the peak of Norse power, and each reveals a different dimension of what these people were capable of. The first is Harald Fairhair, the man who unified Norway. In the late 9th century, Norway was a patchwork of petty kingdoms and independent chieftains, each controlling a fjord, a valley, a stretch of coast. Harald, according to tradition, swore an oath that he would not cut or comb his hair until he had brought all of Norway under one crown. The decisive battle came at Hafrsfjord, near modern Stavanger, around the year 872. Harald won. He combed his hair, and the chieftains who refused to submit fled, many of them to Iceland, where their descendants would build a society deliberately designed to have no king at all. Harald's ambition united one country and created another. The second figure is Canute the Great, perhaps the most powerful Viking who ever lived, though he is rarely remembered that way. Born around 990, Canute was the son of Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark, who had conquered England in 1013. After his father's sudden death, Canute fought a brutal campaign against the English king Edmund Ironside, and by 1016, at the age of roughly 26, he sat on the throne of England. By 1018, he was also king of Denmark. By 1028, he controlled Norway as well. His domain, sometimes called the North Sea Empire, stretched from the rivers of England to the fjords of Scandinavia, a maritime empire held together not by roads, but by ships, not by Roman law, but by Norse custom. The most famous story about Canute, often misunderstood, captures something essential about the man. The legend says he ordered his throne carried to the seashore, sat down before the incoming tide, and commanded the waves to stop. They did not. He got wet. The story is usually told as an example of royal arrogance, a foolish king who thought he could control nature. But the earliest version of the tale suggests the opposite. Canute staged the demonstration deliberately, in front of his flattering courtiers, to prove that even the mightiest king on earth is powerless before the forces of nature and God. He reportedly never wore his crown again, placing it instead on the head of a crucifix in a cathedral. It was a performance of humility, not pride, and it tells us that the most powerful Viking in history understood the limits of power. The third figure never left Scandinavia, and yet her words travelled further than any longship. Her name is not recorded in the historical sources because she is a composite, a representative of the Skalds, the Norse poets who composed and preserved the oral literature that gave the Viking world its memory. The Skaldic tradition and the Eddas, collections of mythological and heroic poetry, contain some of the most vivid and psychologically complex literature of the medieval world. The Norse did not simply fight and trade. They told stories. They believed that a man without stories was a man without worth, that fame after death, the only true immortality, came not from gold or land, but from the tales people told about you after you were gone. The word saga itself is Old Norse, meaning something said, a narrative, a thing that happened and was spoken into permanence. But even as Norse culture reached its zenith, the forces that would end the Viking Age were already at work. The most powerful of these forces was not a rival army. It was a rival idea. Christianity had been spreading through Scandinavia since the 9th century, carried by missionaries, merchants, and political calculation. The conversion was not a single event, but a slow, uneven transformation that took over 200 years. Some kings converted genuinely, others converted strategically, recognizing that Christian Europe would trade with Christian kings more willingly than with pagans. Harald Bluetooth of Denmark, who died around 986, was one of the first Scandinavian kings to be baptized, and he is remembered today for an unexpected reason. In the 1990s, engineers at the Swedish telecommunications company Ericsson needed a name for a new wireless technology designed to unite different communication protocols. They chose Harald Bluetooth, the king who united the tribes of Denmark, and they used a symbol combining his runic initials as the logo. Every time you connect a wireless device, you are invoking a 10th century Viking king. Christianity did not destroy Norse culture overnight. It transformed it. The old gods did not vanish, but were recast as demons or forgotten gradually. The Thing assemblies continued, but now met under the cross instead of under the open sky. Churches replaced temples. Latin replaced runes in official documents. The warrior ethic that had driven the raids began to soften, channeled instead into crusades and pilgrimages. Norse society was being absorbed into the larger body of Christian Europe, And absorption, not annihilation, was how the Viking Age truly ended. The political end came in a single year, and it came with terrible symmetry. In September 1066, Harald Hardrada, king of Norway and the last great Viking warrior king, invaded northern England with a fleet of roughly 300 ships and an army of over 10,000 men. He wanted the English throne. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge on September 25th, the English king Harald Godwinson met him with a forced march from the south and destroyed the Norwegian army in a ferocious day-long fight. Harald Hardrada was killed by an arrow through the throat. Of the 300 ships that had brought his army to England, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home, but Harald Godwinson had no time to celebrate. 3 days after Stamford Bridge, William, Duke of Normandy, landed on the southern coast of England with his own invasion force. William was himself of Viking descent, the great-great-great-grandson of Rollo, a Norse chieftain who had besieged Paris in 885 and been granted the territory of Normandy, literally the land of the Northmen, by the French king in 911. On October 14, 1066, at the Battle of Hastings, William defeated and killed Harald Godwinson. England fell to the Normans. The Viking Age was over, ended on both sides by men of Norse blood. The silence that followed was not the silence of extinction, it was the silence of transformation. The Norse did not disappear. They became other things. In Normandy, they became French-speaking dukes and knights who conquered England, Sicily, and parts of the Middle East during the Crusades. In Russia, the Varangian founders of Kiev merged with the Slavic population and gave rise to the medieval state of Kievan Rus. In Iceland, the descendants of Norwegian settlers preserved the old language, the old stories, and the old laws in near isolation for centuries. The Icelandic language spoken today is so close to Old Norse that modern Icelanders can read the sagas written 800 years ago with relatively little difficulty. It is as if the English could still read Beowulf in the original. For centuries after the Viking Age ended, the Norse were remembered primarily through the accounts written by their victims, the monks and chroniclers of Christian Europe, who understandably emphasized the terror and the violence. The Vikings became a symbol of barbarism, a shorthand for destruction. The horned helmets, which no Viking ever wore, were invented by costume designers in the 19th century and became the most enduring piece of historical fiction in Western culture. The correction began slowly. In the 1800s, Scandinavian scholars rediscovered the sagas and the Eddas and began to publish them. Archaeologists excavated ship burials, trading posts, and settlement sites across Europe. The Oseberg ship, discovered in a burial mound in Norway in 1904, revealed a vessel of extraordinary craftsmanship, carved with intricate animal patterns, buried alongside 2 women whose identities remain unknown, but whose grave goods suggested enormous status. The ship is now displayed in Oslo, and it remains one of the most beautiful objects to survive from the entire medieval world. In 1960, the discovery at Lance aux Meadows proved that the sagas were not merely legend, that the Norse had indeed reached North America. In the decades since, DNA studies have mapped the genetic legacy of the Viking Age across Europe. Roughly 6% of the population of the United Kingdom carries Scandinavian DNA. In parts of northern Scotland and the Orkney Islands, that figure rises above 25%. The Norse colonization of Iceland means that the modern Icelandic population is among the most genetically documented in the world, a living archive of Viking Age Scandinavian genetics. But the deepest legacy is not in blood or bone. It is in language, law, and the shape of political thought. The English language absorbed an estimated 1 to 2 Old Norse words during the Viking Age, and these are not obscure or technical terms. They are among the most common words in everyday English: take, give, get, want, call, die, raise, they, them, their, both, same, wrong, happy, ugly, awkward, skill, trust, window, husband, fellow, knife, egg, root, stake. These are not borrowings from a foreign language in the way that English borrowed ballet from French or kindergarten from German. These are structural words, pronouns, basic verbs, words so fundamental that their Norse origin is invisible. The English language is, in a meaningful sense, a Norse-English hybrid, and every speaker of it carries the Viking age in their mouth. The legal legacy runs equally deep. The concept of the jury trial, the practice of gathering a panel of free citizens to hear evidence and render judgment, has roots in the Norse Thing assemblies. The word law itself, as mentioned, comes from the Old Norse lagu, the word ombudsman, now used in dozens of countries to describe an official who investigates complaints against institutions, is a direct borrowing from Old Norse. The Althing of Iceland, founded in 930, continues to legislate today. The idea that leaders govern by the consent of the assembled free people, rather than by divine right alone, was a Norse contribution to the political imagination of Europe, one that would resurface in Magna Carta, in parliamentary democracy, and in the constitutional republics of the modern world. And then there is the restlessness. The Norse were not merely warriors or traders or settlers. They were, above all, people who moved. They crossed the Atlantic 5 centuries before anyone else in Europe dared. They navigated Russian rivers to reach the markets of Baghdad. They served as bodyguards in Constantinople and carved runic graffiti into the marble balustrade of the Hagia Sophia, where it can still be seen today, the scrawled name of a Norse soldier standing guard in the greatest church in Christendom. They founded cities: Kiev, Dublin, York, Reykjavik. They gave their name to Normandy, to Northumbria, to the Danelaw, to Greenland. They moved because their land was small, their ambition was large, and their ships could go anywhere. So the next time you glance at a calendar and see Thursday written there, pause for a moment. That word is a fossil, an echo of a time when the god of thunder was not a character in a movie, but a force that farmers prayed to before the harvest, that sailors invoked before the crossing, that warriors whispered to before the shield wall locked. Thursday, Thor's day, a word so old, so embedded, so invisible that you have spoken it thousands of times without once hearing the sound of the North Atlantic inside it. The Vikings did not conquer the future with swords. They conquered it with words, and you are still speaking them.